Welcome everyone to our first Zoom meeting for our King's Lynn Gansey KAL. My name is Caroline. I am the founder of Ancient Arts, and I am delighted to have you joining us here. Tonight marks the first night of 3 Zooms for this KAL, and we will have one in another 3 weeks, and then the final one will be on December 15th. Just a little housekeeping so that we understand how the KAL works and everything like that. So I love to do prizes. So in each Zoom meeting, we will give prizes to people who are there at the time. And then, of course, for everybody who's participating and posting, there will be draws for some pretty juicy prizes as well. I usually give away at least a sweater and a couple of shawls, so definitely something to keep in mind. You will be able to post in threads on Ravelry. We will put one in our Facebook group. And of course, you'll be able to comment on posts on social media like Instagram and Facebook. And then there is a hashtag too that you can use there. And the more times that you comment, share, just kind of join in the community side of it, the more entries that you will get in terms of our final prize draws. So like I say, in the Zooms, we'll be drawing some gift certificates because instant gratification, what can I say? It's a great thing. So tonight, what I'm going to do is introduce our collection. Then we'll talk about our King's Lynn sweater. We can talk about choosing sizes and fitting. And then I have a few tips and tricks that Cheryl Toy, our wonderful designer, has suggested that we go over in the first Zoom. And having cast on and excitedly started myself, I think it would be a really great thing to demonstrate. So beginning things that will help you to get started, and a couple of little things along the way will be super useful. So how does the sweater fit into this collection? Well, the collection actually goes all the way back to my fascination with every sheep breed that I can possibly get my paws on and learn about. So as a hand spinner who's been spinning for about 30 years now, what I wanted to do was to try every kind of wool that you could possibly imagine. Little did I know there were about 1,200 recognized breeds of sheep in the world. So it was a bit of a stiff hill to climb, but I did manage to get somewhere between 100 to 150 breeds of sheep before I lost track in terms of trying them. And one of the wools that I really enjoyed was anything that came from the Scandinavian countries. They were just different. They have a different handle, they have luster, they have bounce. They made a really interesting yarn. And so as this company had grown and we've gotten into doing more heritage yarns, using heritage sheep breeds and rare breeds and all of that sort of thing, I thought back to those roots on hand spinning and those amazing fleeces that I had been playing with all those years ago. And that's where the yarn for this collection comes from. So the yarn is named Herli DK. Herli is Norwegian for lovely, because the first sample that the mill sent back to me for me to test knit, immediately those were the words that came out of my mouth, and that's exactly what I emailed back to them. I went, "This is lovely, absolutely wonderful. Now we must have it all of it," which I think probably had them laughing a lot. Luckily, the wonderful people at that mill are used to me nerding out about wool, so they didn't write back anything going, "Okay, you're a bit weird." But what they did was they had a great suggestion, which was to combine this absolutely wonderful Norwegian wool with some beautiful cruelty-free merino to give it just a little bit of extra bounce and a little bit more softness for the person in North America who's a little bit more familiar with your softer merino type yarns. So it's actually a really great balance, because we've got wonderful, strong, brilliant, lustrous Norwegian wool combined with beautiful, soft, squishy merino. And it's made for a really nice yarn that has incredible body. It's lustrous. It likes to dye up in all sorts of beautiful colors. And even better, it's absolutely wonderful to wear. I got my absolute best test on why Norwegians have bred their sheep to be the way they are when we went out and did our second photo shoot, because we went out to the Rocky Mountains and we were like, "Hey, sun, it'll be wonderful." And of course, being Alberta and the Rocky Mountains, of course, we got there and the weather instantly decided to do something else. So there was quite a stiff wind. And in fact, in some of our photos, you can see people's hair going straight back. Had to put a couple of those in the patterns because I thought that was really quite amusing. And there was a lot of stuff falling from the sky that I was in complete denial about. For that shoot, I wasn't smart enough to bring a jacket, so what I did was I threw a shawl over my shoulders from the collection, and wouldn't you know it, none of that wind went through, and I was completely comfortable, even though I was just in a very thin synthetic sweater that was pretty kind of stupid to have worn on something in the Rocky Mountains. So anyway, it really showed why Norwegians have developed their sheep the way they have. So the wool is incredible in that it doesn't have to be densely knit to be able to actually cut wind and keep you warm and comfy. Another fun little thing is that you'll notice that we refer to it as Norwegian wool or as Viking Norway wool. And the reason why we call it Viking Norway is because there is a cooperative in Norway. And what they do is they are a cooperative of farmers and people involved with wool. And what they do is they spend a lot of time very carefully selecting wool, grading it, and then sending it out to be processed in the UK so that it's ready for spinning. And then our mill that turned it into yarn is actually located in Italy. And it's all small family. People have been involved in this industry for a very long time. So there's a real interesting chain of continuity going back hundreds and hundreds of years in terms of who's involved. So when we got the yarn, I decided we needed to know the name of the sheep so we could label it properly, because they had been referring to it as Viking Norway wool. And I'm like, well, that's not a name of a sheep breed. I know that much. So I contacted the Viking Norway people and said, so what's the name of the sheep? And they said, what? It's a sheep. And I'm like, yeah, it's a sheep, but like, what's its name? What kind of sheep is it? A sheep? A white sheep? And I'm like, no. You know, like you guys have, you know, in Sweden, you've got Gotland sheep, and Finland, they have Finn sheep. Yeah, so they thought I was a raging idiot because apparently in Norway, sheep are so ingrained in the culture and they are so important that you don't need to name a sheep. It's a sheep, for heaven's sakes. So finally we got it through my thick head that the sheep are just called white sheep. And if you really, really need another name for them, they'll call them Old Norwegian, which doesn't exactly narrow it down, but is really quite amusing. So it's an interesting yarn, an interesting wool, and a very, very fun yarn to work with in all sorts of different ways. Needless to say, having been through the whole process of developing the yarn, I wanted to do something with it. And of course, Norwegian wool is absolutely scintillatingly brilliant at Scandinavian type knitting. So this seemed an obvious fit. So our collection is themed off of Scandinavian knitting. And what we decided to do was to use a number of different countries in terms of the things it influences, the interests that they have to put into the collection. So we have influences from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the Faroe Islands, and one or two other countries that will fit into the Scandinavian group of countries. And then also we have influences from the Shetland Islands because Scandinavia actually exported a lot of knitting traditions and styles all over the place. And Faroe Isle knitting is actually one that is definitely tied to some of the Scandinavian style colorwork knitting. So we have some Faroe Isle influences in some of our sweaters as well as Scandinavian influences. And then when we put our call out, we decided that we wanted to do something that really referred to like the spectacular landscapes and scenery of Norway, where our sheep are from. And so we decided on the North Sea and of course, Viking Norway, we wanted to honor them. So Vikings and the North Sea is the theme. Then we put out our call and designers, they really rose to the challenge and they all came up with all of these fascinating things that we've divided in the end into three themes. We have the ships and seas. So we have the long ship shawl. We have my shawl, the Greenlander saga shawl. We have amazing hats that are based off of Viking long ships like the Ernest hat. And then we have a second group and they are the shore, so coming to land. And so we have a lot of wonderful sweaters, for example, that are inspired by the patterns that you'll find in the ripples of the water on the sand. And we have, of course, a couple of other different shawls. A lot of them are themed off of cities that would have been really historically important. Some of the pieces are themed off of poetry, for example. And then the final third section of this collection is themed off of hearth and home. So you've been out seafaring on the great wide waters, and then you land and you go home, and what do? Well, you want to be warm and cozy. So we have a number of designs that fit in with the warm and cozy and all of the interesting things that you might have brought home with you after you went a Viking. So for example, the Edda sweater there behind me is themed off of the sagas that Norwegians would write about their travels and their tours. The Vikings like to talk about these a lot. So for example, the Greenlander saga is all about Eric the Red and his family and their travels to Iceland and then to Greenland. Some of them went to North America and founded a colony called Vinland and so on. So this is based on sagas and based on the kinds of motifs that the Vikings were either bringing with them or taking home. This one is by Evelyn Siatra, and it's a really fun sweater. And I tell you, it's going to be really hard for me to just not grab it and run at some point. So the staff are keeping a very sharp eye on me because it fits me. So the King's Lynn Gansey is one of the pieces that fits in with seafaring, because King's Lynn is a town in Britain that was colonized by a lot of people who traveled and visited many times by Scandinavian cultures. And so there's a lot of influence in the knitting styles and the various different cultures that are found in that area. So King's Lynn Gansey pays tribute to that. It's a really, really nice sweater because it uses a lot of beautiful details in it, some really interesting instruction, and I think it's going to be a great one for us to all participate in a KAL with, because I think we're all going to learn something really unique about this. I've been knitting sweaters for a really, really long time, disturbingly close to 50 years for sweaters. And yet, as I look at the pattern for this one, I'm like, oh, there's some really neat details in here that I don't think I've ever actually tried. So that's one of the reasons for the Zoom tonight, is to make sure that we give you some ideas on how to do some of the things that are found in this sweater. But you'll find in here that aside from Gansey's being what the designer has so picturesquely called a timeless traditional sweater, these are really comfortable. For one thing, they're knit on a bit of a tight gauge, which you might have noticed if you've already been swatching. But the other thing about them that's really neat is that they hold the wind out, and they have a lot of really interesting, beautiful patterns. So there are some people who will say that the Ganseys were used to tell sailors apart if they happened to drown, and that's not actually, sad to say, really true. But they still had a lot of really beautiful, unique patterns that would be very distinctive, and each town might have their own tradition in this regards. So our designer has done a bunch of research and drawn on some of that in order to give us a lot of really beautiful classic motifs that you'll find in Ganseys. So we have 6-stitch braids. We have something called a thermal stitch. We have a flag stitch. So there's a lot of simple textures, but they're really incredibly effective. There's little teeny tiny cables in here too. And I think what I'm going to do actually is switch my camera here to make this one spotlighted so we can look a little bit more at the sweater. Oh, I spotlighted somebody else. We're all logged in under the same name, so I'm like guessing which one of me it is. But anyway, here's our King's Linen. So you can see some of these really classic motifs in here. This is our 6-stitch cable. This is our flag stitch. And then we have some beautiful texture here. And then the front, you'll see these really simple little cables. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun to knit this. So at this point, I'm going to give a chance to ask me any questions they might like to, while Dan is actually going to choose somebody to win a $50 gift certificate. So if you'd like to turn your microphone on and ask any questions that you want at this point, that would be wonderful. I do have an agenda of all sorts of things to talk about in terms of the actual construction of the sweater and what you might be getting to for the first couple of weeks of knitting.
So I have a question.
Announce our winner, or wait? Sorry.
You wait.
Oh, wait. Okay.
Judy gets to go first.
Yeah, well, my question is pretty simple. I downloaded the pattern that came today, and it references the errata. Does this pattern already include the errata, or do I need to download that errata sheet as well?
So funny story, I actually am prepared with the original copy to show you what the errata is. Normally, our wonderful and talented Wendy would be setting up the errata page and would be letting you know exactly what it is. But unfortunately, she's homesick. So the errata is, when you look at the pattern, the old copy had this repeat box going to here, and it didn't include the bottom 4 rows. So the errata is that there is now a box around the bottom 4 rows. So not a big deal in terms of anything that it's going to affect you on. If you download the updated copy, you'll all be good. And anything that you might have done to this point in terms of swatching and knitting will still be completely valid. The written instructions were correct, but for some reason that silly little text box just wasn't showing. So it's been updated to have the box there that now shows you the repeat on chart A as well. So that was the errata. And of course, one of our amazing staff found it 2 hours after that pattern was published. It never fails. It's always that way. I can guarantee you that somebody is going to find something in my shawl, because as I have learned the hard way, I will go through it. I will have a bunch of people testing it. We will tech edit a million times. And then the second that somebody else picks it up and starts knitting, there'll be like some silly thing. So anyway, it is always the way of it. And I'm like, all right, well, collections, they tend to be, you know, a little bit that way. So great question. Thank you for asking. So do we have any other questions at this point?
It looks like my pattern has not been updated. So did I download it too early?
Yeah, that's probably the case. So if you bought the pattern off Ravelry, there should be a button that you can click to update the pattern. If you bought it off of our website, there should have been a new copy sent out. Now, I'm not 100% certain if the people who bought kits have had their new copy pushed out yet or not. Perhaps, Dan, you can speak to that?
Both kits and the pattern bought through a website. Second push out happened, but they were both fairly close together. The first push out was probably about noon, and the second push out was about 2 o'clock. So just check your email. There should have been two emails that will have been received by you there. So today.
Okay.
And if anybody is concerned or didn't receive it, just let us know and we will gladly send another email out to make sure that you have it. So you are good to go in terms of knitting. You know, you can get the first part of the sweater done and it's just that one text box that was missing. Repeat box, I guess, is a better way of putting it.
Is that chart A worked back and forth? Is that the one that was incorrect?
The chart itself is correct. It's just missing a repeat box on the first 4 rows.
But it's the chart A worked back and forth.
Yes.
Okay. So that comes down to here.
Yeah, and again, you know, the written instructions for the chart are completely correct. And sometimes when one is unsure about charts, if you're me, what I tend to do is I go and I look at the written and just to compare a couple of lines. But yeah, it's back and forth.
Okay.
There's little things that actually are hidden in charts that sometimes tell you what direction it's worked. So for example, if the numbers alternate so that the odd numbers are on the right-hand side and the even numbers are on the left, that normally means that you're working back and forth flat. The chart should give you some sort of indication if it's being knit like in the round, the rows might all be on the right side, for example, because you're going in the same direction. So there's little things like that that will often give one a little bit of a clue. But yeah, when in doubt, I would love to answer any questions that you have. So speaking of questions, when we go to get started, one of the things that I wanted to show off in this Zoom was the actual provisional cast on. Because the provisional cast on here is done in a crochet fashion, and not everybody has actually worked this one. And I will admit that I am an interesting person because I actually prefer a slightly different version of this one, but this is actually a better the one than I use. So I normally make a big long crochet chain and then I pick up in the back of each one of the chain stitches. This one has you crocheting your start onto the needle so that you have your provisional cast on, but you also have no need to pick up all those nasty stitches.
Well, that's my favorite kind for sure.
It's way better than the one that I normally use because it's so much less work. And, you know, like I say, I have no idea why I insist on doing the one that's a lot of trouble. And I have to laugh because that's exactly what I did for Stephen West's KAL. So there I am, chaining and chaining and chaining and chaining to start all these quarters and then picking up in the back of it. And I'm like, well, why didn't you just do the one where you crochet it onto the needle? Would have been so much smarter. So anyway, the way that this one starts is we're just going to make a loop of yarn. We have a nice lurid pink yarn here, so I'm hoping that shows up nice and clear for everybody. And what we're going to do is put that loop on the needle. And then what we're going to do is take not the tail, ask me what I did earlier today when I was casting on my sweater. Yeah, picked up the tail. But anyway, whoa. It just occurred to me, if I actually walk you through what's written in the pattern, that will help understand what's there too. Sorry about that. Okay, so on the provisional cast on, if you're looking for the instructions, is on page 4. And so you're going to take the yarn, make your slip knot. You don't put it on the needle. I don't know where my brain is tonight. You put it on the crochet hook because, of course, you're going to get going with the crochet hook. You see, it's just like throwing me because this is the better way of doing it. I love it. Anyway, now the crochet hook normally for most people is going to go in their right hand and you will have a needle in your left hand. You want your yarn to run behind your needle. And then what you're going to do is you're going to catch a loop of yarn and you're going to pull that loop through the loop that you initially had, and that will form a stitch. So you have pulled a loop from behind your needle, putting this back on, and that's going to go through the loop that was on your crochet hook. So this is like so nice and easy. At this point, just move your yarn behind the needle, and then you're all set up to grab a loop and pull it through the loop that was on the crochet hook. And look at that, we have 2 stitches on the needle already. Like so decadent, no having to pick up in the back of them. So this is the only thing that you have to do in order to do this provisional cast on, is just each time bring the yarn behind the needle and grab a loop of it with your crochet hook and pull it through the loop that's on the crochet hook. So you're going to keep doing this until you have the correct number of stitches, less 1 for the pattern that you are knitting. Look how slick this is. And I was making myself pick up in the back all this time when I could have been doing this, but no, somebody was too stubborn. So anyway, and if you can't see this clearly, just let me know. I know my lighting is a little weird tonight, and I have no idea what's happened to my lights in regards to that. So I'm hoping that nice bright pink yarn is showing. So assuming that this was the number of stitches that we needed, what we will do is move the yarn behind the needle, and then we're going to take the loop on the crochet hook, and that is your last stitch. It just gets popped on there, and then you can break the yarn, and your stitches are all ready to go to knit your first row. So there we have our nice stitches put on by crochet hook. They are all easy to remove later on when you want to take off the provisional cast on, and you will just start knitting onto these. Now that brings us to the very, very start of our pattern. And what we have here is a set of 4 rows that we're going to work, because we're going to make the shoulder strap. And what is a shoulder strap in this sweater? It is the piece that goes along the shoulder. So here we have the top of the sweater, and we are going to start here and be working this way for our shoulder strap. So this is what we're making. We are making the shoulder strap, which is the top part of the shoulder, and the provisional cast on means that you can use those stitches later on when you go to work the other part of the sweater. So the thing to notice here is that the first time through, the first row will just be knit. The next time through, it says, repeat rows 1 to 4, slipping the first stitch of each row with yarn on back on right side rows and yarn on front on wrong side rows until whatever size that you've chosen, number of rows has been completed. So I want you to note that on the very first row, you're going to knit. The next time you come to this knit row, you're going to slip the very first stitch with the yarn in back. So one of the things that I was getting questions about with people who got a little bit ahead of some of the others in terms of casting on was, why do you want to slip that edge stitch? And it is helpful to slip it all the way along. So here's a little swatch in green that I have done, and you can see the slip stitch edge. And what it does is it just stabilizes this edge and makes it easy in order to find your next row. If you don't slip the first stitch every time, then you won't have that slip stitch edge. And what this does is it stabilizes things. So with a shoulder on a sweater, it wants to sag and it wants to droop and it wants to go places because knitting is incredibly elastic. And having a slipped stitch on the edge of your work will give it a little bit of structure. It's almost like putting some seam binding. So this is another swatch that I did in a bulky yarn, and you can see the slipped stitch on the edge. So I just want to remind you that every time that you come to that first row, when you're repeating that set of 4, you want to slip the first stitch. So interesting way of writing it. And it's one of these things that when you write a pattern, you're supposed to write them as concisely as possible. So that's why it's done this way. Now, there's a great question in the chat. And should we always slip purlwise? Yes. So unless a pattern tells you to slip knitwise, always assume that you're going to slip purlwise. So in this case, you just slip, moving the yarn either to the back or the front. And it's going to be very intuitively obvious, because when you go to start your next row, at the beginning of the row, the yarn will already be behind the needle, so you just leave it there. And when you go to do the wrong side rows, the yarn will actually be in front of your needle and you will be about to purl. So it's very easy to have that little visual cue as to what you're going to do in terms of slipping. So I do want to remind you to just keep doing that, because what this does is it prevents the piece from sagging too much. So this wants to do this. You see how stretchy that is? but the slip stitch edge doesn't let the entire piece go. So that's why the designer has made the choice to put a slip stitch edge on the edge of this particular shoulder strap. So are there any questions at this point?
I've done a crocheted provisional cast on before, not this method. And it's just horrible, horrible trying to get that crocheted edge off. This one just pulls off.
There's a trick I'm going to tell you about in terms of what to do with that. So when you break your yarn off later on, it's going to undo really easily from one end and not so easily from the other. So from the one end, you have a knot, and it's a pain in the butt to try and get it to undo from there. And you end up with teeny tiny scissors saying rude things and cutting it off. The other end is the one where it'll unzip like a zipper. So what I always do is I actually put a few knots in that end, just in the middle of the leftover yarn here. And then I know which one is going to give me my unzipping later on.
Okay,
So,
and that's the end that you just cut from the longer piece of yarn you started with.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So let's take our little swatch off here. And I just pull that yarn from underneath there, and then this is going to unzip. Oh, it's not unzipping from that end. Okay, you know what? I'm going to figure this out for you, because the way that I normally do it, it just unzips. So I'll figure it out, and then I'll actually post it on social media and put something into the Facebook and Ravelry groups as well, because this isn't the one that I'm used to. I do know that it should just unzip, and I always do mark it with a knot. I've just, like I say, having a dumb moment right now, probably because I think.
Well, yeah, Caroline, could I just step in? Because I think I saw what you did that makes it not zip.
Yeah.
Is when you're doing the chain over the needle, if you put the last stitch onto the needle, that's going to be pretty permanent. But if you, instead of putting the last stitch up on the needle, you make a few more chains hanging off the needle, that will unzip.
That's normally the way I do it. I'm following the way that is written into the pattern here. So I'm going to have to experiment because, you know, I agree with you. I always do about 3-4 extra chain loops. And then, like I say, I'll pull the yarn through temporarily so that it's tied off, and then put a knot on that end. And then all I have to do is go and slip the end through the last chain, and then it just unzips. So I've done something weird here, and I should be able to figure it out for you. I just don't know what the weird thing is that I've done.
Yeah, probably just since you stitched into the last one, once you unpick it, maybe it'll come out.
That's my guess too. But like I say, I'll make sure to update us on that, because this is a really interesting question. And by goodness, I'm going to find the answer to it. But at least knowing how to make the chain on there is a useful thing.
I always use that cast on, and it unzips like you say it will.
Yeah, I just did something weird at the end there.
Yeah.
I do the same thing for provisional cast on, and then I do some extra chains and pull the yarn through, and then I still usually can't just unzip it, so I just pick it all apart and pull the end through the loops. It's a real pain, but I can't get it to unzip either most of the time. And sometimes I can, and I have no idea what I'm doing wrong.
So normally what I would have done, let me just finish here. Normally what I would have done is I would have put some extra chains on the end, as I'm doing here. And then I'll pull that end through temporarily and have my knot in it. But then when I go to do the unzipping later on, what I will do is I will put the end back through the way it went. And then from that side, it just undoes. So it'll just unzip right off the knitting. It's just this business about the loop on the end and knitting into it that I think is the issue. So like I say, I'll investigate that and get everybody an answer on it.
One thing that helps is to use a smooth yarn for the provisional, something that's slippery so that it doesn't.
Superwash in Lurid Pink is your friend, because yes, it does make a huge difference. If you do the provisional cast on with a fuzzy yarn, like for example, if you were doing it with the Hairley, that would definitely make it more challenging. One piece of advice that I do want to mention here is that our staff have found that stitch markers to mark where you are in your rows is a very useful thing, and they gave the advice to let everybody know to put stitch markers in, and that'll help you keep track of where you are with the various charts and so on. So I just wanted to pass that little tip along as well. Okay, so we have talked about why the slip stitches and how they add structure, but how does one pick the stitches up when you go to pick up along the edge? So we've made our shoulder strap. We are all excited because it looks beautiful. Here is my fake one. This would be for a giant, but it is a shoulder strap nonetheless. And I am doing it in large bulky size so that I can give you a little bit of a better view at what we're doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up stitches along the side of it, and then we can work down the back of the sweater. Well, along the side there. How to put it? We're going to work down the back and down the front. And so we pick up stitches along the side in order to do that. Now, you will notice that in the pattern that the designer refers to as selvage. So she has a selvage edge that's 2 stitches. The first one is slipped, and that's the very first stitch. And then the next stitch is just worked in a normal stocking stitch. And that's the second one, is the one that we will want to use when we go to actually do our pickup. So identifying it, and one moment, I'm just going to put my needle back into this poor innocent little swatch. Anyway, identifying the stitch that we're going to pick up in along the side is definitely important, and this can be a little bit of a brain-numbing thing to do. So just a moment more here until I get these all popped on. Should have had 3 swatches, I think. Live and learn. Okay. Here is my little stitch. Little tiny swatch. So this is in actual size, and I'll lift it up here to the camera. This is in actual size in the yarn that I'm using for the sweater, and then the other swatch is larger so we can see it. In order to identify the stitch that we want to do, what you'll do is go to the second stitch in on your needle. Let's put something light underneath this because I really am not sure just how great this is showing. So what we will have here is the second stitch on your needle, and you're going to look down from below that stitch and you will see your regular knit stitches there. The slip stitch wants to curl to the inside, and you'll see both legs of the stitch actually roll to the inside. So let's look at our white swatch, and we can see that there too. So the stitches are rolling to the inside. That's our edge stitch. So when we go to do our pickup, we don't want to pick up in that slip stitch because that's going to give us great big loose loops. And you don't want that because you see how loose those are. We don't want to pick up in that first edge stitch because it's hard to pick up and it's going to give you a nasty little hole all the way along the edge. We want the second stitch. So in my big swatch, the second stitch is here. And what we want to do is pick up on the inner leg. So that is the one that's in towards the body of the knitting. So where's my needle? Right here. If we're looking at this swatch, we have our edge stitch, which has happily moved itself out of the way. Then we have the next stitch in, and we want the inner leg. So we're going to use the inner leg to pick up. So you're going to pick up on the left leg of the edge. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this one, like I say, it can be difficult to identify when you're working with a swatch that's a lot smaller. So the easiest way to do that is to go down from the needle along the second stitch in, and then you can find that leg. Now, normally this would not be sitting on a needle. It's just there to hold the stitches so I could show you how you're going to count down, but it's the second leg in. So when we look at this kind of dark stitch here, I have the left side of the stitch with my needle in there, and I can pick my stitch up and just start knitting. So go to the second stitch in, you'll look at that nice little V that it forms, and you want to have the left-hand side of that V where you're going to pick up your stitches. So if I was to say pick up in the middle here, I would go to that left leg and pick up. So it's exactly the same thing. No matter where you are in a piece of knitting, if you've been instructed to pick up on not the first stitch. So again, we're going to pick up here and here and here and here. So we can see that nice flat stitch there. We pick up on that left leg. When you go to pick those stitches up, one of the things that's always of concern when you are picking up is how many stitches to pick up in the piece, if you had picked up in every single row, what you're going to find is that you get a very wavy edge. So it's almost impossible to find a pattern that has you picking up the same number of stitches as you do rows. So if I'm knitting a size medium, I have to pick up 40 stitches in a piece that is 52 rows long. So one of our intrepid staff actually has done something that's really handy for us. And she said, for just about every size in the pattern, the easiest way to do it is pick up 4, skip 1. So you're going to do it in units of 5, pick up 4, skip 1, pick up 4, skip 1. And then for my size, I only have to work in 2 stitches where I'm going to skip 1 extra. So I have 52 stitches, 40 to pick up. So I do it in sets of 5 where I pick up 4 out of 5. And then a couple of places, I'll just leave an extra one in the middle of those 4 so that I get to the final correct number. This is the same thing that you would do if you were working a button band, is that depending on the size of yarn and your tension, you would pick up 2 in every 3 stitches for your button band, or maybe 3 in every 4. And in this case, it works out to 4 in every 5. So that's quite a few stitches, but there's a lot of weight on these, and your shoulder strap will pull out to be a little bit longer, and it'll all balance out just beautifully. Let's get our original here so that we can have another look at that. So you can see the shoulder strap there. And you can see that the selvage stitches are not showing because you've picked up in that inner leg. So that's the other thing that's important, is that you pick up on the inner leg, which is the one on the left when you're looking at it with the edge to your right. And that means that you will get a nice clean edge that has that beautiful 2 stitches showing there. And on the inside, what it looks like is this. You see how you have this line of slip stitches, and that is providing structure to the sweater. And your pickup, if you roll them out of the way, will be in that second stitch. So is this making sense?
Mhm.
Excellent. And like I say, when you take the full-size sweater and pull it, you can see that that slip stitch edge really does give it some great structure. One of the things about sweater construction that's always so important is having something there to give it support. So a lot of like the yoke sweaters, they will tend to sag over the yoke if it's a very heavyweight sweater. And that's because there's no seams or anything to give it some structure. Sweaters that are knit in pieces and seamed always have structure because the seam itself will provide that. So in this case, without putting a seam in, the designer has given you the structure without the issue. So Barb has a question, and she's asking what this color is. This color is oak. I do love this color, and I was kind of unaware of just exactly how much I love it until I went back and looked at a lot of the things that I knit, and I'll find it in quite a few pieces. But it was also perfect for the King's Lynn because it was the gold of a crown and perhaps a Viking chief. And thank you for saying that it looked great on the models. Everybody did look fantastic. I'm very sad that this sweater is too small for me because I might have taken it and run as well. And I was very pleased at how great it looked on my spouse, although there was one person on social media who felt that the buttons were a little bit too ladylike for him. But when I make his sweater, I will switch for a nice set of wooden buttons, although I thought he was quite fetching with his gold buttons. Okay, so there is one other thing that I wanted to show you, which is that once you have picked up your stitches, then you're going to do a backwards loop cast on to add some more stitches to your needle. And not everybody is familiar with a backwards loop cast on. And when you're working with knitting that's on the needles already, it's actually super easy to do. So you will have your wrong side sitting up, or your right side, doesn't really matter. And a backwards loop cast on is literally just a loop that's put backwards on the needle so that it can't just pull itself off. So my way of doing it is to put the yarn over my finger and just flip the loop on the needle. And in this case, you can see that the loop itself is actually holding the yarn in place, so it can't sleaze around as easily as it would if I did the other direction. So if I put the loop on in the other way, oh my goodness, that's a brain buster, that one. No, I'm still getting a backwards loop, but it's a little bit, doesn't really matter. I have noticed when doing sweater underarms, if you don't do a backwards loop properly, then what happens when you go to knit them is it just all falls off the needle. So a backwards loop will hold itself in place. And like I say, the easiest way to do it is put the yarn under and over your forefinger, and then just flip the loop onto your needle. So that works really well. Now, backwards loop cast-ons are really interesting because they use the exact same amount of yarn as a knitting stitch does for the most part. There's almost no difference in there. So what you want to do when you do a backwards loop cast-on is you want to snug them up in the same amount of tightness as you would have with your regular knit stitches. And if you don't do that, then there's an issue in terms of suddenly you've got all this excess yarn in regards to trying to knit. So if you get those backwards loop cast-ons where you say do your underarm and you've got this huge loopy loose thing, that's what's going on, is you want it to tighten it up so that it's the same tension on your needle as your regular knit stitches. Now, I never let Dan announce our winner for our $50 gift certificate, so I'm just going to pause there and let him do that.
Oh, yes, that's right. Is my mic on right now?
Yes.
Okay, yes. The winner is Wendy Leduc.
Congratulations, Wendy. So what we're going to do is have you email us at sales@ancientartsfiber.com, and Dan will put that into the chat for you. And then we will arrange to get your gift certificate to you in whatever format you would like. So while Dan was drawing that, I found my other needle and my larger yarn, and I'm just going to demonstrate our backwards loop cast on again. This is one, by the way, if you're ever doing any color pooling or anything like that, and you want the colors to line up with the cast on, this is the only one that will allow you to do that. And conveniently, I actually have a shawl sitting here that is a color pooling one. And you see how the cast on edge does not actually match the piece of knitting itself. That's because normal cast-ons actually use more yarn or different amounts of yarn than do regular knit stitches. So backwards loop is a really nifty cast-on method because it uses the same amount of yarn as a regular stitch. So again, with this needle and larger yarn, what you're going to do is put the yarn over your forefinger and just flip the stitch onto the needle. And just keep on doing that. Remember to tighten the slack in these, because if you leave them loose and floppy, when you go to knit them, they're a nightmare. You get these big, long stretches in between the stitches. And then if you're me, you start saying things that cause the cat to come over and steal the knitting because he noticed you for all the, shall we say, selective language. So when you put them on, just give them that little tug and tighten them up. So backwards loop is super easy and super fun. And if they're tighter when you go to actually knit the stitches after you've done them, then you don't get those great big long loops in the middle. So you can see this one is behaving pretty well. And that's because I snugged it up. Now you can still get a bit of that, but once you form the stitch, it goes back to being a nice cast on that sits neatly along the edge of your knitting. So one of the big tricks that a lot of people don't realize about backwards loop is to simply make sure that you snug each one of those stitches up. Now, because I had a big loose loop here with a knot in it, you notice how I have a bit of a loose cast on stitch here. So that shows that I didn't tighten this loop up enough, but if it bothers you, you can just tug your cast on edge a little bit and that'll pull that slack in. So the key to backwards loop cast on, tighten those stitches up, and you'll think sometimes, holy smokes, I've tightened them too much, but no, they'll be fine the way they are. You want them to have the same tension on the needle as the knitting itself, which means that you do have to pull that yarn relatively snug. The other thing that can happen with yarn is that as you keep doing this, if you never let go of it, it'll start unplying itself. And you can see some of these stitches looking a little bit weird. So just let the yarn go periodically so that it can equalize the twist in the yarn, and then you won't get that effect on the needle. They'll behave themselves and look normal. So sometimes people will come to me and say, I don't understand why the yarn looks so weird. And it's just simply that as you do this motion, it's untwisting the yarn slightly, and that can build up until it's unplied itself temporarily. If it happens, it doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt your knitting. It's not a big deal, but it is something that can be a little bit less sightly than one might want. So that basically concludes the tips that I was going to give you for the first part, because at this point, once you've done your backwards loop cast on, then what's going to happen is you're going to go and work along the back of your piece. So I just want to check our chat and see if we have any questions I've missed here. Mr. Ancient Arts is saying that he doesn't think he has a career as a model, but apparently we have to disagree because we put him in quite a few of the sweaters in this collection because a lot of them are designed to be unisex or any gender can wear them. And one of the things that I always want to do is show people how great they look on people of all sorts of different body shapes and types. So you'll notice that in all of our patterns that we have multiple models. And I do need to give full credit to my staff because they all stepped up and were willing to have their photos taken and their measurements done. And they really gave us a good view at how sweaters, shawls, and so on look on people that you find on the street. I love, beautiful photo shoots with lovely gracile people, but I'm not gracile and not shaped like them. And so seeing them on regular people really does help. And we have listed for each one of these the ease in the 2 different models that will be represented in the shoots. The other thing that I will point out is that when we're looking at sizes, we've tried to be as inclusive as possible. So we have 9 sizes that go up to a 60-inch bust at least. Some will go a little bit past that. And with hat sizes, we don't all have the same head size. So each one of the hats also has multiple sizes, which is really nice because I have a little teeny tiny head and it's very frustrating to make a beautiful color work hat and have it sit there like a pot, which, trust me, has happened to me a number of times. So I was very excited when our designers gave multiple sizes because that meant that for once I could knit them and not have to worry about whether or not it's going to just sit down around my shoulders. So my lovely Zoom people, are there any other questions that you have or comments that we can make, things you'd like to know about the collection?
I'd like to know how many people are online here and where they're from.
That's a great question. So we have 15 people right now. It's a nice small group tonight. And it was kind of amusing because I had dozens of messages throughout the day with people going, well, I'm going to watch it once you post it online because I've got X family thing tonight. And I'm like, yeah, we didn't think about that when we picked this date, did we? But anyway, if you guys want to put in the chat or even unmute yourselves and say where you're from, that would be really cool.
Well, I'm from Olympia, Washington.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful.
I'm Judy's friend from Olympia, Washington, too.
Fantastic. Lovely to see you,
And
Alana
Caroline.
and Judy.
Hey.
Judy and Alana were at Knit City. They bought their
Yes.
yarn for this at Knit City.
That's so fun. That's wonderful. Well, you guys have been waiting a long time then.
Yeah,
Mhm.
anxious.
I'm in West Kelowna.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
Where's West Kelowna?
BC,
Okay.
Okanagan
North
Valley.
of us.
Oh, north of
Sunny
us.
Okanagan, where it's not very sunny at the moment.
And I'm in Leduc, just south of Edmonton.
Lovely.
From Tennessee.
Ooh.
I'm Maple Ridge, which is outside of Vancouver, BC.
Very
which is
fun.
nice. Which is nice because Rowan does their stuff, and it's like you got to get up in the wee hours in the morning. This is so nice. We
Yeah.
don't have to get up and look our disheveled selves. Thank you.
True, but the Rowan events are pretty darn neat, and I will put a little thing out there in that there's somebody here tonight who's actually teaching there with some pretty interesting looking classes coming up. And that would be Barb Barone from Yarniversity. And
Hi,
Barb,
everybody.
you're torturing me because theoretically I don't have time to take classes, but boy, those look good.
Thank you, Caroline. Hi, everyone. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, and it's so nice to be here. Caroline, love those new sweater designs. Those are just amazing, and the hats to go with them. So just wanted to ask, you ship all over, right?
Yes, we do. Absolutely. And, I really appreciate that. We will ship anywhere and everywhere that you can possibly get a courier or postal thing. And sometimes we find really creative ways of shipping. So we have shipped to Antarctica, which meant getting boxes into the hands of pilots through various nefarious means.
Hi, I'm from Airdrie.
Oh, wonderful. I used to live in Airdrie. I should mention too, by the way, for anybody who's watching the recording later on. So the sweater is designed in a specific Norwegian yarn. But one of the things that I always say is that I don't necessarily have the exact yarn that a pattern is designed in. And this collection is designed for you to be able to substitute yarns. You are always welcome to join our KALs if you are using a different yarn. We do have somebody who is actually going to be knitting this sweater, and she decided to use our Nettle DK yarn, and I did swatch it for her and it works perfectly. So don't feel like if this particular yarn isn't your jam that you can't participate. And remember that all patterns should be available to, you know, every yarn that would be that you can get the right gauge from, and that is a material that's not going to do something terrible like suddenly sag. Looking at you, alpaca.
I've done a sweater in your nettle yarn and it's beautiful. I can wear it next to my skin.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that. And that
love
would
it.
be one reason why somebody might want to switch this. It's interesting because I find a lot of wool scratchy. This one isn't at all, and neither is the Lascaux. But I know my hubby has actually asked for this sweater in the Lascaux because he finds it more comfortable to wear. So yeah, the Nettle is a really great option as well. And we do all of our DK yarns, with the exception of the Merino, the superwash, at the same yardage, etc., so that they can be interchangeable.
Now, are we supposed to have a certain amount done by the next Zoom meeting?
So one of the things that is always a feature of our KALs is you do not have to be at the same place that we are. What we do is we record them to make sure that, you know, when you've gotten a certain distance, we have the tips and tricks that you need. But in order to be eligible for prizes and to participate, you do not have to be at any specific place in the knitting, because some of us knit like the wind and others of us knit at a more deliberate pace, or maybe don't have as much time to do it. So you don't have to be anywhere specific, because if you're not exactly where you need to be for the next Zoom, that's okay. You'll be able to watch the recording later on. The other neat thing about our next Zoom is that we're going to have the wonderful Cheryl Toy with us, and she's going to discuss a number of things. So she's suggested that she's going to talk all about something that's fascinating to me, which is how to combat cable flare, because I don't know if you've ever knit cables before, but sometimes they can really do some really crazy, funky, wavy things. So one of the neat things about this sweater is it's actually designed to combat that and not have the cables go all shapeless and wonky. So she's going to talk about it in general and give you some ideas there on what you can do in regards to dealing with it. She's going to talk about what she refers to as the union row on the front, because she said that sort of construction can be a little tricky for people at times. So she wants to give you just a little bit of a designer's knitter's view that goes beyond a written pattern in terms of how to handle that. We'll be looking at one row buttonholes, and we will be inviting you to bring any questions that you might have. There will be a third Zoom, like I said, on the December 15th, and I believe the next one is December the 1st. And you will be able to, again, ask any questions, and we will have more information in the final Zoom about finishing and so on. But again, we don't expect you to be there necessarily, and somebody, naming no names, that looks an awful lot like me is highly unlikely to be finished the sweater in the term of the KAL, because somebody had promised a number of designs to other people, and she might want to be getting those out too.
Can I just ask a question about a different sweater?
Yeah.
I'd like to know what Wendy is wearing.
Wendy, can you tell us what your beautiful sweater is?
Yeah, it's Zweig. I don't remember who. Yeah, I don't remember the designer. It came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. The light color is actually one of yours from Ancient Arts. I don't remember the name. I've got it all on my Ravelry page, but it's one of my go-to sweaters.
I thought it was
beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Thank you.
Caroline, I was wondering if we could just go over choosing sizes a little bit.
Yes, definitely. Okay, I have put my pattern somewhere right in front of me and lost it. I have amazed myself at how I can do that. So one of the tricks, and that is really important in regards to choosing pattern sizes, is to always have a look at your pattern and see how the pattern is listed in terms of finished circumference versus bust size, what amount of ease is on the models, and so on. So choosing a sweater is not just about the bust size, it's about how it fits, and it's about where on you that you need to be taking your measurements. So in this particular case, this sweater is meant to have positive ease. It could be worn with less than the models have, but the positive ease allows you to have a shirt underneath it, which again, this is meant to be an outerwear sweater, is probably a great idea. Both models actually had the same ease for this sweater, and one of them was our wonderful production manager, Heather, and the other is my lovely and beloved spouse, Dan. So they had exactly the same measurements in terms of ease, but you'll see that it sits a little different on them in terms of the shoulders. And that's a place that's very important to consider when you're choosing your size. So the more accurate size in a lot of choices for sweaters is actually to measure your upper torso. And so that's above the bust, because when you take that measurement to choose your sweater size, you're going to be starting off with something that fits you better in the shoulders. So for me, I actually have a really interesting conundrum because I have very narrow little shoulders and I have a lot more down below. I can tilt my camera to show you a little bit about how I'm a lot bigger here than I am here. So for this particular sweater, what I'm going to do is consider how much ease is built into the sweater, how much ease I might need, and then I'll pick my size based off of that. So the finished measurement is what's listed on this sweater, and that gives me some choice. So I know in my case that my upper torso measurement is 38. So the closest sweater size to that is a 39. And this has 3 1/4 inches of ease built into it based on how it fits on the model. So for me, I might have a little bit of trouble fitting my chest in, but knitting is incredibly elastic. And so it's actually going to give me a pretty good fit in the shoulders and arms. And it might be a little snugger over my chest than it is on the models, but that's actually a really good way for me to pick a size. Did you have some other specific questions, Emma, or comments, considering that you are a...
No, I just wanted to hear your take on it, because I
Yeah,
think it's
it's always a challenge. It's all about how much looseness do you want and where. So for example, if I don't mind having lots of looseness over my shoulders, and you can see that on Heather in the photos of this sweater, Heather's got a lot more looseness there. If I don't want it to be tighter over my chest, if I want to have a lot of room in there, I would definitely go up a size at that point. So my bust measurement is quite a bit different. I have another 7 inches to go. So instead of picking the size 39, if I want lots of ease over my chest, then I would probably go up to the 43 or the 47. The problem with the 47 is that that is going to have so much looseness in the shoulders that it's going to really affect the fit of the sweater. So for this one, I think that you're better to go a little bit more on your upper torso measurement and have a little bit less ease lower down, just so the sweater doesn't really bag over your shoulders. One of the things about how sweaters fit too is that different construction types will affect sizes that you pick. So for somebody like me who has narrow shoulders and more down below, a sweater that has a set-in sleeve will actually give me a little bit more flexibility in terms of something that will have a better fit. This one is, oh God, now I'm forgetting the name of this sweater type. Do you remember, Emma? It's a noun.
Gansey?
Which one is?
It's a saddle
It's not just
shoulder.
thank you, saddle shoulder. It's like, I'm thinking it's a saddle strip. What's it called? Oh, for heaven's sakes, brain. So saddle shoulders are actually better for people with wide shoulders in terms of they give them a lot more area there. So this is one of the reasons too why I would want to be careful about making one of the big sizes for me, is that because this style of construction has quite a bit of room in the shoulder, if I pick something that's too big to have lots of looseness over the chest, then it's going to be really floppy. So for those of you who have narrow shoulders, don't go up too big in the sizes, because it is a saddle shoulder sweater. If conversely, you've got really broad shoulders and you don't change a lot here, it's a little easier for you, because then you can just worry about how much ease do you want in general. So I know one of the things about Heather that I envy greatly is that she actually has a really nice set of shoulders. And so when she goes to pick her sweaters, she can just pick off of her bust measurement and not worry about that sort of fit. But that was a great question, Emma, because this one for somebody like me is a little more of a challenge in order to fit. So upper torso is strongly recommended, and there are a lot of options in terms of how much you want to adjust the ease by. Now, Barb has also said, could one do a combination size, i.e. a 39-inch shoulders and a larger chest size? You definitely can, but some sweaters lend themselves a little bit better to adding in room than others. And this one, because it's patterned all over the entire sweater, you would have to have enough knowledge to be able to add in something that wouldn't look strange in order to get a little bit more room in the bust. Now, one of the nice things that Cheryl is going to talk to us about in the next Zoom is some issues like adjusting sleeve length and torso length on the sweater. So one of the things is that when I knit a sweater, I always have to add about 6 inches to the sleeves because I have these crazy long arms. I swear I was meant to be 5 feet tall and I was stretched like a Gumby. Anyway, so she's going to give you information on where the best points in the sleeves and the body of the sweaters are in order to do length adjustments, whether it's to lengthen it or to shorten it. So this is one of her really, really, incredible offers to us, is to give us some ideas on how to make these a little bit more customized for ourselves.
For the yarn that is recommended in the pattern, do you suggest switching out every couple of rows, alternating the skeins?
What I would do is have a look at the color itself, because Hairley's kind of a fun one. We have 10 colors like this oak one that are really, really solid, vividly saturatedly dyed colors. And so with those, I really don't worry about swapping back and forth between skeins. But then there's other colors, like, for example, Spanish lavender, and you can see that there is variation in the color in the skein. Absolutely, with those, I would be alternating skeins. There is a cool little trick that you can do that helps you to cheat, because a lot of this sweater in the body is knit in the round, and swapping back and forth in the round can be a bit of a pain. So if you're swapping back and forth every couple of rows, twist them together before you knit with the next one. So bring the old yarn up underneath the one that you just finished knitting with, and that'll twist them, but it also means you won't get as much of a tendency for it to pucker. Just watch that though, and make that first stitch when you change yarns not too tight so that you don't get a pucker. The other thing is that this is a non-superwash yarn, and you can do something called a spit splice if you want. So what I often do is I'll just knit 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters with a skein, break it, spit splice it with the next skein, and then knit an inch, centimeter to 2 centimeters with the next one, and alternate those. That's enough to break up any potential pooling that might happen with hand-dyed yarn. And it's not, oh goodness, I have now puckered all the way up the side of my sweater prone. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do it, but it is a really good comment. So like I say, with this being a hand-dyed yarn, it is something to be concerned about, but there's quite a few of these colors that are super saturated, and it's not necessary. So when we set up the kits, hang on. We set them up with oak, you won't need to alternate that. Irish linen, you won't need to alternate that. French Bordeaux, you won't need to alternate that. Any of the denim series are a little bit, they're based off of blue jeans, so there's a little variation in those. So I would suggest alternating denim. 7 C's is about as saturated as you can get with a really gorgeous teal. Don't need to alternate that. Baby aubergine is meant to be the light reflecting off of a baby eggplant. So could have a little variation, less prone to it than denim. Woodland and cypress are both greens, and again, they're super saturated, so you'll be good with those. So really, out of the kits for this one, the only ones that you have to worry about are denim and baby aubergine. All the rest of them will be either super saturated or they're actually the natural color of the yarn. And any irregularities occurring in there are actually just due to the blending of the fibers. So that's something interesting, and it is a great question.
Yes,
Because
really
there's
know that.
Sorry?
Oh, I was just saying, I'm really glad to know that.
Yeah, with the kits this time, we're definitely picking colors for the more complicated patterns like this one. We're picking colors that are super saturated, so there's less of that having to be fiddly. I would not, if somebody hasn't bought their yarn yet and is planning to do so, I would not use a variegated yarn for this sweater, because you'll lose a lot of the detail of those beautiful cables and the flags and so on. So I know I had a lady asking me yesterday about would Scottish Mist work for it, and Scottish Mist is very variegated, and I said to her, no. I would save Scottish Mist for something really fun, like maybe one of the cowls. The Scandies cowl would be amazing with a variegated and a dark color, and we will be having kits set up like that because we all started drooling at the thought. It would be absolutely stunning in the brioche hat, but anytime that you have a lot of texture or pattern, it's not the best. The other place where it could work is if you're building your own set of colors for something like the Etta cardigan, you could put it in there because there's strong contrast there. You just have to be careful where you're putting the variegated color and make sure that you maintain the contrast of the original color choices. So are there any other questions?
I am being very brave, or maybe stupid. I have arthritis in my hands and my left hand is pretty bad. So I did my swatch in Portuguese knitting, which I'm not that good in, but now I have to knit the whole thing because my tension is much tighter. So I'm going to be very slow and I hope it all works out.
Well, you know, I think that's actually a really good knitting method for when you do have arthritis, and the fact that it's going to be tight actually works out too, because one of the keys to Scandinavian style knitting is that their tension is really tight in general. And the reason is twofold. One is that they don't want air going through because, you know, if you live in a mountainous region, you're going to have an awful lot of cold air blowing through if it's loosely knit. So it helps to make them more airtight. It makes them more waterproof. And then it also means that the sweater will wear better. So we know that every yarn out there that has natural fibers is prone to pilling, and at some point it will do that. But when it's knit more tightly, it actually will help with reducing pilling. So some of these fibers in some of these heritage breeds will tend to pill a little bit at first, but the tight tension helps to actually protect the yarn and make it last longer. I'll just give you a little aside of something that I found fascinating. So a friend of mine, Barb Brown, her great-grandmother was actually one of the people who lived out in the Cowichan Valley area, and she was involved in the first Cowichan sweater knitting. She came from Sus, Shetland area, and she emigrated to the country, and she did a lot of teaching of color work and sharing of ideas with the native people there. And I got a chance to see some of the Fair Isle sweaters that she had knit. And these sweaters are darn near 100 years old, some of them. And it's unbelievable that they had actually gone through multiple generations of family. They had been worn and worn and worn, but for the tight knitting that they had done, these things looked, some of them almost brand new. And it's really fun because Barb Brown actually has photos of her family with 3 different generations, wearing one of them in particular that we photographed at the museum there. And it was unbelievable in what good condition that this sweater still was. And it was due to this tight tension. So long story short, I think your Portuguese knitting and tight tension will stand you in good stead.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And if you're ever in Shetland, go to the charity shops.
Yes.
You'll get one of the sweaters that's maybe 40, 50 years old and it still looks new.
Exactly. And you know, one of the fun things about the Hairley yarn is, of course, I am scientifically minded, and so I have to experiment and do all of that kind of stuff. And one of the things I really love about this is that it gets a little bit of a patina almost. It gets a little bit of a fuzz on the surface, but then it really starts sticking to itself. So it's not felting, but it's doing what it should to be a proper Scandinavian sweater. And it's exactly what the Fair Isle sweaters do. So their yarns do the same thing. They have that fuzz that beds together and then locks together and almost folds like a woven textile. So I've been playing with, you know, wearing a lot and, you know, getting it all good and sweaty on my neck and things like that. And it's so neat to see this heritage wool behaving the way it should for that sweater to last for generations.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. You have been very patient with me and let me run us over the hour that we promised you. If there aren't any more questions, then what I'm going to do is let you go so that you can spend the evening working on your sweaters, wink, wink. But I really want to thank everyone who came out for this and who has made this such a fun hour to spend chatting sweaters and North Sea collection and so on. And we will be sharing a lot more about the collection along the way. And I hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did in the creation.
And thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Caroline.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very
so much.
welcome.
You're good.
Have
Thank
a
you.
fabulous weekend, everybody.
Thank you.